This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a professor of Jewish history at UCLA, who recently gave a talk at the Van Leer Institute about his current research into the Hassidic settlement of Kiryas Yoel in upstate New York, which offers a unique insight into questions of diaspora and sovereignty in Judaism. It is also the first ever recurring guest appearance in the history of the Tel Aviv Review. About 2 years ago, we discussed the works of your teacher, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. So this is a moment to remember indeed. Professor David N. Myers, welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
Well, it's really great to be here, Gilad, and really great to be back here a second time.
Mm-hmm. So Kiryas Yoel is a village about 80 miles north of New York City that was established in the 1970s by Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, the leader of the Satmar community, which is known for its hardline ultra-Orthodoxy as well as its stringent and radical anti-Zionism. So before we delve into the meanings and interpretations of Kiryas Yoel as a case study, please take us briefly through the history of the place. What was it that took thousands of Hasidim from Brooklyn to a suburban area in New York State?
Well, to tell that story, we have to tell a little bit about the story of the Satmar Hasidic movement and Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, the founding rabbi, who was born in the northeast region of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 19th century into a very fiercely Orthodox family. The Teitelbaum family was known as one of the leading Hasidic families of Hungary and renowned for its combative spirit against all forms of innovation. And that ethos really left a deep imprint on Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, who established his own dynasty in the Romanian city of Satu Mare, previously known in Hungarian as Satmar, in 1934. He lived in that community for 10 years before the entry of the Nazis into Hungary. The overwhelming majority of the Jews of Satu Mare were deported to death camps. Rabbi Teitelbaum himself, in a twist of irony, was rescued by none other than Rudolf Kastner on the Kastner transport. Ironic because Kastner was a Hungarian Zionist official, and Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, as you mentioned, was renowned for his unrelenting anti-Zionism.
Already in
already
Hungary.
Yes, already as a defining feature of his rabbinate from the teens and 20s. Mm-hmm. He was opposed to all forms of innovation, but took particular aim at Zionism, which he saw to be an arrogation by humans of the divine prerogative to end the long exile of the Jews and restore them to their homeland. So he was rescued as part of the Kastner transport, and following that made his way briefly to, after liberation in Switzerland, made his way very briefly to Eretz Israel, and then came to the United States in 1946 to raise money for his institutions that he hoped to create in Jerusalem. Well, it was in New York that he found a small cohort of very enthusiastic followers who encouraged him to stay. And indeed, he did stay, making his way to the Brooklyn neighborhood of Williamsburg, where he left a very deep imprint. But already from his first weeks and months in Williamsburg, which is a community over which he had a transformative impact, he really introduced his unique form of stringency and piety to that community. But already there, and already as he set out to create a new community in Brooklyn, he instructed his closest advisors to begin to search for a place outside of the city to create a kind of shtetl, as he called it, that would be at a remove from the seductions and allures of the teeming multi-ethnic, multicultural urban center.
Did he really want to replicate the shtetl lifestyle that he knew in Europe and was destroyed by the Second World War?
Yes, that was the declared ambition, and here's the twist in the story. Satumari bore no resemblance to what Kiryas Yoel is. It was a mythologization of what was in Europe. Satumari, whence the Satmar Hasidim came, was itself a multicultural, multi-ethnic, small East Central European city, 1/4 of whose population was Jewish. Mm-hmm. So when they spoke of a shtetl, they really had an imaginary construct in mind, because nothing resembled what would be created in Kiryas Yoel. A completely homogeneous, thoroughly insular settlement cut off from the outside world, a kind of enclave society, to use Mary Douglas's
language.
What
was that particular locality was chosen?
Why was it?
What was so special about that place where Kiryas Yoel was?
What was so special about it was that it was just about the only place that Satmar Hasidim could buy land. Because from the mid-50s, they began their efforts to purchase land in the surrounding states close to New York City, New Jersey, and then in some of the counties north of New York City itself. And what they encountered was considerable resistance. It turns out that your average suburban American, typically white, segregated in his own little enclave, isn't interested in selling land to strange-looking Hasidic Jews who promise to bring with them hundreds, if not thousands, of their co-religionists. And on a number of occasions, the Satmar Hasidim were frustrated in their efforts to purchase land in New Jersey and New York. So they got smart to the challenge ahead and entrusted the task of land purchase to the brother-in-law of one of the leaders of the Satmar community, who was a clean-shaven, non-observant Hungarian Jew, who served as the front man for the land purchase operation, and in the early 1970s made his way to Virgin Territory, a place where they hadn't sought to purchase land before, Orange County, New York, and began, through this person, Oscar Fisher, to purchase land.
And when the Satmars started flowing in, how were they welcomed?
Well, they didn't start flowing in for a couple of years. It took about 2 years for the development to take rise. 80 garden apartments and 25 single-family homes were constructed between 1972 and 1974. In the spring of 1974, advertisements began to appear in the local Yiddish press in New York, calling attention to this new exciting prospect. It's at that point that the residents of the town of Monroe first caught wind that this development that was taking rise was intended for a group of Hasidic Jews. The first settlers began to arrive in the summer of 1974, and almost immediately tensions began to develop.
It took Rabbi Teitelbaum almost a quarter of a century until Kiryas Yoel was established. Is it because of those technical difficulties that we're talking about? He knew he was going to start a shtetl from the minute he set foot on American soil, or did it take some time?
I think shortly after he arrived, he saw the need to create a shtetl. I'd say there are three reasons why it took so long. One, he really concentrated a tremendous amount of effort in building up Williamsburg as, in a certain sense, the capital of Malchus Satmar, the capital of the kingdom of Satmar. Second, he encountered very considerable resistance on the part of non-Hasidic Jews to the prospect of a Hasidic settlement. That's the second reason. And third, the idea didn't gain universal appreciation amongst his followers, some of whom thought that creating that kind of standalone settlement would call attention to Satmar Hasidim in ways that would not be beneficial to the community. For example, it would make clearer who was and who wasn't enlisting or registering for the draft. That kind of isolated existence would call attention to what this community was doing in a much more concerted way, as opposed to simply living in the midst of the city and sort of disappearing in that kind of excitement and energy of the city. So those three reasons, I think, explain why it took so long.
And another ironic aspect of this thing is that, in essence, if you look at it perhaps from a bird's eye view, it's a very American endeavor. I mean, you're a religious group looking for your own piece of land somewhere in the wilderness, so to speak. It is perhaps a lot more American than Jewish.
Absolutely. In fact, I like to say that this is an experiment almost without precedent in Jewish history, but a very common phenomenon on the landscape of the United States. Unprecedented insofar as we don't know of that many examples of communities that achieve legally recognized autonomy in the Jewish diaspora. This kind of phenomenon would be impossible in Europe, where you have state establishment of religion, one recognized religious community, and in no instance that I know of is the state prepared to grant this kind of official recognition to a segregated religious community that deviates from the establishment religion, even the establishment Jewish religious Gemeinde or community. Mm-hmm. So we don't know of this phenomenon in Europe. It's somewhat unprecedented in Jewish history. It's very familiar to those who recognize the legal and political landscape of the United States. Strong forms of religious subcommunity are not only permitted to survive, but very often flourish on American soil. Mm-hmm. There's something about the American ethos that values and appreciates this kind of religious community, extending back to the Puritans who came in search of religious freedom, mm-hmm. and extending up to what may be the most extraordinary example of this kind of exercise of religion by a group, which is the state of Utah, which is controlled to a great extent by the Mormons of that state. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Kiryas Yoel fits very much into that American story.
Did he recognize it?
Did he?
Yeah.
They didn't recognize the extent to which they were enabled by the American system to create this really unprecedented experiment. They did, however, have tremendous appreciation for America. They regarded, and still do, America as a Malchut Shel Chesed, as a kingdom of grace, unlike many other regimes under which Jews lived, including a good number in Europe.
And the State of Israel, of course.
And, of course, the State of Israel, which is known in Satmar Lore as Malchut HaRisha, as Memshelet Kofrim, as a government of transgressors. The juxtaposition between the two is quite stark. So you'd have very few Satmar Hasidim acknowledging that their community is an American phenomenon, but I think your instinct is absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Not only is its existence enabled by America, but over the course of time, as a result of a certain tradition of political engagement and accommodation characteristic to Satmar, external values begin to migrate into the community and shape it in ways that give it a distinctly American flavor. For example, one community official very memorably told me, with great regret, that Kiryas Yoel has become a two-party system, owing to a bitter succession battle. But in using that formulation, nothing could be more foreign to the vision of Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum than the idea of a two-party system, a distinctly American.
Sure, and of course, bipartisan opposition to Israel. Gradually, they established some sort of autonomy, perhaps the purest form or the most advanced form of religious Jewish autonomy, as we said, anywhere in the world. Can you take us through perhaps the institutional nitty-gritty of what that autonomy means?
Yeah. So just as a historical backdrop to that question, we should note that the classic medieval Kehillah functioned in its own way as an autonomous entity, largely in controlling religious affairs within the community. I tend to think of Kiryas Yoel as a form not just of autonomy, but of what I would call local sovereignty, whereby there's a much greater degree of governmental authority that inheres in the community itself. So this wasn't necessarily intended. Rabbi Teitelbaum wanted to create a shtetl, and indeed a shtetl was created in 1974. But almost immediately, tensions began to develop between officials of the town of Monroe and the new Hasidic settlers over zoning, over what constitutes a single-family home, whether that's a classic American nuclear family of a mother, father, and two children, or a family of 12 and the brother of the family of 12 with another 12. Whether or not it's permissible to have a mikveh or a matzah bakery or a nursery school in the basement of a garden apartment. Mm-hmm. These sorts of characteristic features of Satmar life were deemed violations of the zoning norms of the town of Monroe. And tensions began to boil over in 1976, at which point there were lawsuits being threatened back and forth between the two sides. It's at that point that the idea of creating a self-standing village out of the town of Monroe, a village that would essentially secede but still be part of, in some formal way, the town of Monroe arose. And this
was that also unprecedented? Can a group of houses secede from a local authority and declare their own kingdom?
It turns out that in the state of New York, it's very easy to do so.
Oh, right.
You need 500 signatories who occupy no more than 5 square miles of land. So we could take 495 of our friends and go create our community in the state of New York as well. And it's actually astonishing that more groups with a decidedly separatist bent have not done so. It's important to note that there was a precedent to Kiryas Yoel, and that is the case of New Square, New York, the prototype for this kind of Hasidic settlement, which was a group of Skver Hasidim who made their way to the suburbs of New York in 1954, and then 7 years later, owing to the kinds of zoning issues that arose later in the case of Kiryas Yoel, decided to seek incorporation as a village, carving a village out of the town of Monsey, New York.
And another perhaps well-known equivalent is Lakewood, New Jersey, that was set up by another Hassidic, by Rabbi Kotler.
Right. But that's a different model. It's important to note Lakewood's a different model.
That's exactly my question. How is Kiryas Yoel different from New Square and
So New Square and Kiryas Yoel are the same model. Lakewood is different. Lakewood was a popular vacation destination and a self-standing city before Rabbi Aaron Kotler decided to create his yeshiva, to replicate the yeshiva that he ran in Europe in suburban New Jersey. So he decided to create a yeshiva there. And then over the course of time, in part because of the success of the yeshiva, large numbers of traditionally observant Jews made their way to Lakewood and now represent close to, or perhaps now, a majority. The case of New Square and Kiryas Yoel are quite different. These are groups of people who came to an isolated area, settled in it, bought private property, and thereby exercised their classic liberal rights to own private property, concentrated themselves into a sufficiently large group, and then, really as a result of the idiosyncrasies of New York state law, transformed themselves into a public square overnight. They then became their own self-standing separatist enclave, quite different from Lakewood, which was a pre-existing entity that has experienced larger and larger influxes of traditionally observant Jews. And this is interesting. The difference between the two also has an interesting analog in the realm of education. Not so much Lakewood, but Monsey, New York, which is 25 minutes away from Kiryas Yoel and is the site of a very substantial population of traditionally observant Jews, Hassidic and non-Hassidic. It has come to the attention of lots of Americans that in Monsey and neighboring East Ramapo, Orthodox Jews have taken control of the public school board by electing themselves to it, even though none of the members of the school board send their children to the public school system.
Yeah, so exactly that leads me to my next question about the tension between state laws that clearly apply or should apply to all the residents of that place and their willingness, their inclination to run their own affairs according to their own views, which, of course, they can, being the overwhelming majority of the residents of that locality.
Right. So the case of Monsey is one in which the Orthodox population, or a number of representatives, have been elected to the school board, although they have no children in the schools, and presumably were elected, decided to run for office and get elected in order to affect the overall policy of the department, especially of the system, especially with regard to taxation. So it's possible to control the tax rates as members of the school board, lower them.
Who are the students in that school if the locals don't send schools to them?
They're 85% of the students in the East Ramapo School District are students of color.
Who come from outside the village.
Yes. So there are many. The town of Monsey is made up of various villages, and the town itself has a substantial population of non-Haredi Jews. They attend the public school, And yet the public school is overseen by a group of Orthodox Jews who don't send their children there, who want tax rates to be lower and more resources to be devoted to private school kids.
And how is that going?
There's tremendous tension there.
Mm-hmm.
But
this is today?
Today. Tremendous tension. Mm-hmm. That's received a great deal of attention. But there is a different model that Kiryas Yoel operated according to, and that is rather than take over the school board of neighboring Monroe-Woodbury, they decided to create their very own public school district within the self-contained boundaries of their community. Mm-hmm. That's a very different model. The effects may be similar, though, in that tensions invariably arise with neighbors beyond the boundaries of the village. Certainly, tensions arose when this idea came up of creating a public school district within a religiously homogeneous village. Mm-hmm. Both critics from within the community said this is a Trojan horse that will lead to the importation of foreign values, and many critics outside of the community, including liberal American Jews, said this is an outright violation of the separation of church and state. Mm-hmm. So there was tremendous opposition to that, and it made its way all the way up to the United States Supreme Court in 1994.
And how did that end?
That ended with the Supreme Court saying, in fact, the statute that the state legislature of New York enacted to create a Kiryas Yoel public school district was illegal because it made explicit reference to that community. But if the legislature drafted a statute that did not mention the community, it would pass constitutional muster. And the New York State Legislature did so on 3 or 4 occasions, and finally, after 15 years of litigation, that school district was declared constitutional.
So the Kiryas Yoel leadership are all bloody troublemakers. I mean, there's still to this. I mean, it's not just teething problems of a community, perhaps in the early years. It's still. I mean, it's
yeah. Well, here's what I'd say. 2 things to that. One, the community doubles in size every decade, which means the demand for resources is constant, and community leaders in Kiryas Yoel work relentlessly on behalf of the well-being of their community. This means that they often find themselves at odds with the leaders of surrounding communities who fear the encroachment of this community, which, for example, just recently sought to annex an additional 700 acres from the town of Monroe and another neighboring town, which had the effect of creating a very significant public movement comprised of residents of Monroe and dissidents within Kiryas Yoel to beat back this annexation attempt.
Why did the dissidents come out against it?
Well, there's a tradition of dissident factions that extends back to the period immediately following the death of the founding Rebbe.
Just for spite, then?
No. They would say that they have been oppressed by the establishment leadership in the community. The leadership in the community, the establishment leadership in the community would say 2 things. One, we live according to the noble American ideal of cultural pluralism. And in addition to that, all we do is play interest group politics as one is expected to play in America. That is to say, it's a rather simple equation. You organize, you accrue political power, and you seek to influence. That is a decidedly American phenomenon as well.
It sounds like Kiryas Yoel is a pretty volatile tinderbox. Do you think it's there to stay, or will it implode at some point?
Well, I think we see 2 countervailing currents. One is the current of massive growth. This current rate suggests that it'll reach somewhere close to 75,000 residents by the year 2035, which will make it really the first Hassidic city, certainly in the diaspora, which is a kind of remarkable phenomenon. The other current is the kind of multi-causal current, one strand of which is the fractiousness and division within. And another important strand is what many community leaders regard as the gravest threat that Kiryas Yoel faces and that Haredi life in general, which is the internet, which cracks open all borders and unlocks that kind of enclave world that Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum and his followers so assiduously built up.
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot that remains to be seen, and I'm sure that you'll come back for a 3rd appearance here on the TLV Review at some point. Professor David N. Myers, Professor of Jewish History at UCLA. Thank you very much for coming in today to talk to us about Kiryas Yoel.
Too short, but fun. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
אל השבילים עוד נוסע ורואה את עצמי מרחוק, את הקולות עוד שומע ונזכר באותן חוויות. כאן חלומות רק חלמתי